Snow whipped across the empty road that night, turning the world white and silent. In the middle of it all, a woman knelt beside her stalled car, shaking, alone, and losing hope by the minute. From the distance, an old pickup truck appeared through the storm, headlights cutting through the dark. Inside were a Gulf War veteran and his teenage son on their way home from another long day's work. They had no idea that stopping to help this stranger would change all three of their lives forever. Because sometimes, the coldest nights bring out the warmest hearts. If stories of faith and kindness still move you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. The wind had a voice that night, a hollow, restless sound that rolled across the flatlands of the Texas Panhandle. It rattled the fence posts, swept through the barren fields, and howled like a warning through the open sky. Jack Miller kept his eyes fixed on the icy road ahead, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel. The headlights of his old pickup truck barely cut through the swirling snow, each gust blurring the world into a storm of white. Beside him sat his teenage son, Eli, quiet but alert, his breath fogging up the window. They were heading home after delivering feed to a neighbor's ranch, the kind of job that never cared about weather or holidays, work that had to be done, storm or not. Jack had learned long ago that duty didn't ask for comfort. The years after the Gulf War had hardened him into a man who moved through life with measured caution, expecting little from anyone but himself. Yet even with that stoic calm, there was something about this storm that pressed on his chest, a heaviness that whispered of trouble ahead. The radio had gone dead miles back, and the horizon had disappeared into the blizzard's gray curtain. Eli, still young enough to see wonder where his father saw danger, leaned forward and said, "It's getting worse, Dad." Jack gave a short nod. "Keep your seatbelt on, son. We'll be fine." The truck's tires slipped for a second, and Jack steadied the wheel, his jaw tightening. He'd seen worse, but never with a kid in the passenger seat depending on him. The thought of something happening out here, of being stranded, stirred a silent prayer he didn't even realize he still knew how to make. The snow thickened, and the sky seemed to drop closer, pressing down with a quiet menace. Just then, Eli pointed ahead. "Dad, look!" Through the blur of frost, the faint red glow of taillights flickered in the distance, unmoving. Jack slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. A car sat half buried in a drift, its engine still running but wheels spinning helplessly against the ice. For a long moment, Jack didn't move. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to mind his own business and get his boy home safe before the roads vanished completely. But as the wind howled across the empty plains, a voice deep inside reminded him of something older than fear, the sense of duty that had followed him from the battlefield to the ranch. He sighed, rubbing his hands together, then reached for his gloves. "Stay in the truck," he said. "Let me see what's going on." Eli's eyes widened. "Dad, we can't just leave whoever's in there." Jack hesitated, then nodded slowly. "No, son. We can't." The cold hit like a wall when he opened the door. Snow whipped against his face, stinging his skin, and the wind pushed at him with invisible hands. He trudged toward the stranded car, boots crunching through the drifts, each step heavier than the last. The closer he got, the more he could see. A woman inside, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her face pale and frightened in the flickering light. Jack tapped on the glass, shouting to be heard. "You all right in there?" She startled, eyes wide, then nodded shakily. He motioned for her to unlock the door. "We need to get you out. This car's not going anywhere tonight." The door opened, and a blast of icy wind rushed in. I can't move it," she said, her voice trembling. "The road just disappeared." Jack nodded firmly. "We've got a church about a mile down. You'll freeze here if you stay." Behind him, Eli was already climbing out of the truck, pulling his father's old army blanket from the seat. "Here, ma'am," he said, his tone gentle but sure. Jack shot him a look, part pride, part worry. The woman wrapped herself in the blanket, her eyes glassy but grateful. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name's Grace." Jack tipped his hat slightly. "Jack Miller." "That's my boy, Eli. Let's get you warm." As they helped her to the truck, the storm seemed to swell around them, almost alive, snow whipping sideways, wind moaning through the trees. Jack guided her into the cab, closing the door firmly against the storm's fury. Eli climbed in after her, brushing snow from his jacket. Jack started the engine, glancing at the woman through the rearview mirror. She was shaking, her hands clasped tight around the blanket. Something about her eyes, a mix of exhaustion and fear, told him this was more than just a case of bad luck on a winter road. But he didn't ask. Not yet. "Hang on," he said, turning the wheel toward the faint glow of the church steeple in the distance. "We'll get you safe." The truck crawled forward through the whiteout, its tires gripping patches of ice and mud. Jack kept his focus locked, the sound of the storm roaring in his ears. Ailey looked back at Grace, offering a reassuring smile that somehow seemed to cut through the cold. For the first time that night, Jack felt something shift, small but real. Maybe this wasn't just about surviving the storm. Maybe, just maybe, God had put them on this road for a reason neither of them could see yet. The thought flickered quietly in his mind as the headlights found the outline of the old church ahead, standing like a sentinel in the blizzard. The church stood alone on a rise above the road, its wooden cross glistening with frost beneath the storm's relentless breath. Jack parked the truck near the front steps, the tires sinking into snow. The wind howled through the trees as they hurried inside, the door creaking open with a groan. The air inside was cold, but still, the kind of silence that carried the weight of old prayers. Candles lined the altar from a past Sunday service, their wicks unlit. Jack struck a match and lit one, its glow spreading faintly through the dark. "We'll stay here till it passes," he said, his voice low but firm. "Plenty of walls, no drafts. We'll be all right." Grace's hands trembled as she lowered herself onto a pew. Her coat was soaked, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Eli knelt by the old wood stove in the corner, trying to coax a fire from what little kindling remained. Jack watched him for a moment, the boy's quiet focus reminding him of his mother, before turning to Grace. "You hurt anywhere?" She shook her head, clutching the blanket tighter. "Just cold. I didn't think it'd get this bad so fast." Jack nodded. "Storms out here move quicker than sin." The faintest smile crossed her lips, but it faded just as fast. Whatever she was running from wasn't just weather. As the fire began to crackle, the warmth filled the small church, chasing away the chill that had settled in their bones. The light flickered across the wooden beams and the small stained glass windows, casting soft colors on their faces. Eli brought Grace a mug of water from their thermos, his tone gentle. "Here, ma'am. My mom used to say warm water helps when your hands won't stop shaking." She accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you," her eyes glancing at the boy with something like tenderness, or maybe memory. Jack turned away, pretending to check the doors, though he was really just giving her space. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, but inside the church, time seemed to slow. Grace stared into the fire, the orange light reflecting in her tired eyes. Jack could feel the questions building, who she was, why she'd been out there alone, but he knew better than to push. In his years of service and silence since, he'd learned that truth rarely came when demanded. It had to find its own way out. Still, something about her presence unsettled him. Maybe it was the fear in her eyes, or the way she flinched every time the wind shook the windows. Whatever it wasn't just the storm that had driven her here. Ayla broke the silence first. "You from around here?" he asked. Grace shook her head, her voice soft. "No, just passing through." Jack's gaze sharpened, but she didn't elaborate. "Road to where?" he asked. She hesitated, then murmured, "Anywhere but where I came from." Jack exhaled through his nose, a slow, measured breath that said more than words. "Fair enough," he said. "Storm's got no favorites." Grace looked up at him, maybe expecting judgment, but found only a tired kind of empathy, the look of a man who'd seen too much to cast stones. Hours passed like that, the fire crackling, the storm roaring beyond the walls, and 3 souls sitting in its calm center, bound together by chance. Eli eventually drifted to sleep on a pew, his jacket wrapped around him like a cocoon. Jack sat across from Grace, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. She spoke suddenly, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to stop." Jack looked at her, the candlelight catching the deep lines on his face. "No," he said quietly, "but I couldn't drive past and sleep right tonight." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Most folks wouldn't have." Jack leaned back, his gaze softening. "Most folks haven't learned what it's like to be left out in the cold." Grace looked at him then, really looked, and saw the weight behind his words. The storm outside roared again, as if testing the strength of their refuge. But inside that small church, something had shifted. They weren't strangers anymore, not quite. There was an unspoken understanding, born from shared solitude and quiet faith. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something stir beneath the armor he'd built around his heart, the faint warmth of compassion waking from its long sleep. As the fire dimmed and the night deepened, Jack stood and checked the window. Snow still fell heavy, but his mind was calmer now. He turned to Grace and said softly, "Get some rest. Tomorrow'll bring its own kind of trouble." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening in the candlelight. "Good night, Jack." He nodded, settling down near the door, his rifle beside him more out of habit than need. The church was quiet again, save for the soft breath of the sleeping boy and the low hum of the wind. And somewhere in that stillness, Grace, in more ways than one, had finally found a place to rest. Morning arrived in silence, though it was hard to tell where night had truly ended. The storm still hung heavy over the small town, pressing gray light through the stained glass windows like smoke from heaven itself. Jack stirred first, his back stiff from sleeping against the wooden pew. He looked toward the altar. Candles still flickered weakly from the night before, casting long shadows that danced over the cross on the wall. Ailey was curled up under a blanket, one hand tucked beneath his head, while Grace sat quietly near the fire, staring at the flame as if it might reveal her future. The quiet was deep, the kind that humbles even the strongest hearts. Jack rose slowly, stretching the soreness from his shoulders. "You get any sleep?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that echoed through the empty sanctuary. Grace looked up, startled, then nodded. "A little. The wind, it kept me awake." Jack gave a small grunt of understanding. "It does that." He walked to the window and peered through the frosted glass. Snowdrifts buried the road, and the churchyard fence was nearly invisible. "We'll be here a while," he muttered. Grace said nothing, only tightened the blanket around her shoulders. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was cautious, like 2 souls standing on either side of an invisible line neither dared cross. Eli stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Morning?" he mumbled. Jack nodded. "If you can call it that." The boy smiled faintly, the kind of optimism only the young could carry through a storm. "We've still got some jerky and crackers, right?" Jack reached into his bag, handing him a small packet. "Make it last. Roads won't clear till tomorrow at best." Ayla divided the food evenly, giving the first share to Grace without hesitation. She hesitated to take it, glancing toward Jack as if asking permission. He nodded once, and she accepted, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to." Jack shrugged. "We don't leave folks hungry under God's roof." As they ate in the faint glow of the fire, the church creaked and sighed with every gust of wind. The sound wasn't frightening anymore. It was strangely comforting, as though the building itself had decided to endure alongside them. Grace broke the silence first. "You two from around here?" Jack nodded. "Born and raised. This old town's all we got left after the droughts took half the farms." She looked down at her hands, tracing invisible lines across her palms. "I used to live in the city. Everything was louder there. People, lights, even the silence felt different. Out here, it's like time slows down." Jack studied her for a moment, but said nothing. Eli, sensing the heaviness between them, leaned forward. "I like it when time slows down," he said. Makes you notice things. Like how the snow outside looks blue before the sun hits it. Grace smiled faintly, her eyes softening with a kind of maternal fondness she hadn't shown before. You notice things most people miss, she said. Your mother must have taught you that. The words hung in the air like a quiet hymn. Jack looked away, his jaw tightening. Eli lowered his gaze. She did, he said softly. She passed when I was 8. Grace's expression changed. Sorrow, understanding, apology all mixing together. I'm sorry, she murmured. Jack finally spoke, his tone steady but distant. It's been years. We manage. For a while, no one said another word. The fire crackled softly, and the wind outside began to fade to a low hum. Grace stared at the cross near the altar, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. Funny, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I haven't been in a church in years. Not since. She trailed off, swallowing the end of her sentence. Since things fell apart. Jack turned slightly, watching her. Churches don't hold grudges, he said quietly. Doors stay open whether you come back or not. Grace smiled, a small broken thing that spoke of both gratitude and guilt. Maybe, she said. But sometimes it's not the church you're avoiding, it's what's inside yourself. Jack didn't respond, but her words hit deeper than she could have known. He'd spent years avoiding the same thing. The ache of loss, the questions left unanswered, the faith that had withered after war and death. He turned back to the window, pretending to check the storm. The snow was easing, but the air still shimmered with frost. He found himself whispering a thought he hadn't meant to say aloud. Sometimes, the storm God sends isn't to destroy you. It's to bring someone to your door. Grace looked up, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his tone. Do you really believe that? She asked. Jack met her eyes, steady and calm. I'm starting to. The hours stretched into the gray afternoon. Eli kept the fire alive, humming quietly under his breath. Grace began to help, stacking candles and sweeping melted snow from the floor. The simple act of doing something, anything, seemed to lift the heaviness from the air. Jack watched them, arms crossed, saying nothing but thinking plenty. He'd taken in a stranger out of duty, but now something deeper was stirring. There was trust forming here, fragile but real, built not on words, but on shared silence and survival. The storm outside was finally slowing, but the one within him had just begun. That night, as they prepared to rest again, Grace whispered a quiet prayer beneath her breath. Jack heard it, though he pretended not to. It was short and trembling, like someone remembering how to speak after years of silence. For reasons he couldn't explain, it gave him peace. And as the last candle flickered out, Jack found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this storm had a purpose after all. By the next morning, the world had gone white. Snow lay piled against the doors, the church half buried under a sheet of frozen light. Jack woke to the sound of silence, the kind that follows after a storm, when the earth itself seems to hold its breath. He stoked the fire and checked their supplies. A handful of crackers, a few bottles of water, 1 can of beans. We'll make do, he muttered. Eli rubbed his hands together for warmth. Think it's over? Jack shook his head. Not yet. Roads'll be blocked till tomorrow. Grace sat quietly near the window, her eyes fixed on the frost clinging to the glass. There was something far away in her gaze, like she was somewhere else entirely. Jack noticed the look but didn't pry. He'd seen that same expression on soldiers who'd lived through things they never spoke of. You holding up all right? He asked finally. She turned toward him, startled, then nodded too quickly. I'm fine. The lie sat heavy in the air, but Jack let it pass. Storms like this make everyone uneasy, he said. But you've got good company. She smiled faintly, though her hands trembled. I appreciate what you've done, she said softly. Both of you. Jack nodded, his eyes shifting toward the fire. Just doing what's right. He said it like a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Hours crept by, each one slower than the last. The church grew colder as the woodpile dwindled, and Jack rationed their food carefully. Eli tried to keep spirits high, talking about his school friends and the ranch animals they'd left behind. Grace listened, her laughter quiet, but genuine when he made a joke about the stubborn old mule that refused to come in from the rain. For a brief moment, it felt almost normal. 3 people sharing warmth against the cold. But underneath it all, tension hummed like a wire. Jack could feel Grace watching the window too often, as if expecting someone or something to appear through the snow. That night, the storm returned in bursts, tapping at the windows like a restless ghost. The wind found every crack in the old wood, whispering through the church rafters. Jack sat near the door, rifle across his lap, though he didn't know what he was guarding against anymore. Grace sat near the fire, her hands folded tightly, lips moving in a silent prayer. Ailey watched her quietly. "You pray a lot," he said gently. She blinked, surprised by the question. "I used to," she said. Then I stopped. Didn't seem like anyone was listening. Eli tilted his head. "Maybe you just weren't talking loud enough." Grace smiled faintly, a tear escaping despite herself. "You sound like your mother," Jack said softly, almost without thinking. Grace looked at him then, really looked, seeing the sorrow buried beneath the calm. "She must have been special," she said. Jack nodded, his eyes distant. "She was." The room fell quiet again, save for the whisper of the fire. Grace hesitated, then spoke in a trembling voice. "I had a husband once. He passed a few years ago." Jack met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no guardedness between them, just recognition. 2 people carrying different versions of the same loss. "Grief's a funny thing," Jack said after a moment. "You think you've buried it, but it just finds new ways to speak." Grace nodded. "Sometimes it shouts." Later, when Ely fell asleep, Grace finally spoke what had been haunting her since the night they met. "I wasn't just driving to get away from the storm," she said quietly. "I was running from something, or maybe from myself." Jack didn't interrupt. "I worked for a company in the city," she continued. "They wanted me to lie, to sign papers that would have hurt good people. I refused. And they turned on me. I lost everything, job, apartment, friends. I didn't know where else to go." Her words broke softly, like ice cracking underfoot. "I thought leaving would give me peace, but it just made me feel empty." Jack's expression didn't change, but something inside him shifted. He saw the tremor in her hands, the shame that shouldn't have been hers to carry. "You did the right thing," he said finally, his tone firm but gentle. "Even when it cost you." She shook her head. "Doing right doesn't feel much like winning." Jack looked into the fire, his jaw tightening. "Sometimes it's not about winning. Sometimes it's about standing." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire hissed softly, and the storm outside began to quiet. Grace looked at him, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Do you ever stop doubting?" she asked. Jack gave a tired smile. "Every morning I try. Some days I almost get there." In that small church buried under snow, faith was being tested, not by lightning or thunder, but by the simple, quiet battle of hearts, learning to trust again. Jack had seen war. Grace had seen betrayal, and both had walked through storms far colder than the one outside. Yet as the last embers glowed, something invisible stirred between them, not romance, not salvation, but a slow return of faith. The kind that doesn't come all at once, but in flickers, like candlelight in the dark, fragile yet unyielding. And as Jack closed his eyes beside the dying fire, a verse from long ago drifted through his mind, words he hadn't prayed since his wife passed. "Peace, be still." For the first time in years, he believed it might just come true. The storm's rage returned after midnight, hammering the windows with sleet and snow. The church groaned beneath the weight of ice, the walls trembling as if bracing against a force older than wind itself. Jack sat near the dwindling fire, poking at the embers with a metal rod. Each crackle echoed through the hollow room like a heartbeat. Across from him, Grace sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly together. The candlelight painted her face in shifting amber tones, revealing the fatigue etched deep into her features. There was a story in her eyes, something heavy, something she hadn't told yet, and Jack could sense it waiting just beneath the surface. Eli stirred awake on the pew, blinking at the dim light. "It's still storming?" he asked sleepily. Jack nodded without looking up. "Harder than before." The boy sighed, pulling the blanket closer. "Feels like it'll never stop." Grace smiled faintly, her voice soft. "Storms always stop eventually. You just have to believe they will." Jack glanced at her then, not with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity. "You sound like someone who's been waiting out storms for a while." She hesitated before answering. "Maybe I have." Her voice trembled, and she took a breath as if steadying herself against the cold truth pressing to escape. The minutes stretched into silence, broken only by the wind's restless hum. Then, without warning, Grace spoke again, the words spilling out like a confession carried too long. "I left everything behind," she said quietly. "My home, my job, even my name on the door. I worked for a firm in Dallas, Financial Investigations. We were supposed to expose corruption, not feed it." Jack's gaze lifted from the fire, his eyes narrowing slightly. Grace continued, her tone raw and trembling. "My boss asked me to alter a report, to protect a donor, someone powerful. I refused. Within a week, they made me the problem. I was threatened, blacklisted, dragged through court hearings I couldn't afford. When I realized no one was coming to help, I left." Eli sat up fully now, listening in silence. Grace's voice cracked. "I drove without thinking, just followed the road until I couldn't anymore. I thought maybe God would meet me somewhere along the way, but all I found was snow." She laughed softly through her tears, not out of humor, but disbelief. Jack leaned back slowly, arms crossed. "You stood for what was right," he said, his voice steady. "That's more than most would have done." Grace shook her head. "And for what? I lost everything. My reputation, my home, my faith." Her words faded into a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if doing the right thing was worth it." Jack didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, the reflection of the flames dancing in his eyes. "You're not wrong for asking that," he said finally. "War taught me that doing the right thing doesn't always make life easier. Sometimes it breaks you first." Grace looked up, startled by the gentleness in his tone. "Then why keep doing it?" she asked. Jack exhaled slowly. "Because once you stop, you lose more than your peace. You lose who you are." The weight of his words hung in the still air. Eli, sensing the gravity of the moment, spoke softly. "My mom used to say that too. Good choices don't always bring good days, but they bring good sleep." Grace smiled faintly, wiping at her eyes. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "She was. Stronger than I ever was." He looked toward the cross at the front of the church, the flickering flame making the shadow sway gently. "When she passed, I stopped talking to God. Figured he'd already said all he needed to." Grace followed his gaze to the altar. "And now?" she asked quietly. Jack hesitated. "Now I'm starting to wonder if maybe he's been waiting for me to listen again." The fire popped, sending sparks into the air like scattered stars. Grace reached out slowly, placing a trembling hand over her heart. "I thought I was running from my past," she said, her voice trembling. "But maybe I was running toward this moment." Eli's eyes softened. "Maybe the storm brought you here for a reason." She smiled through her tears, nodding. "Maybe it brought all of us here for one." The church fell silent again, not empty but full of warmth, of presence, of something divine stirring quietly between them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, peace began to find its way through the cracks. Jack stood and added another log to the fire. "You did good, Grace," he said quietly. "The world's short on people who tell the truth, no matter the cost." She looked at him, eyes glassy but grateful. "I didn't do it for courage," she whispered. "I did it because I couldn't live with the lie." Jack nodded. "That's the difference." He turned back toward the flames, his silhouette outlined in the light. "Courage isn't about feeling brave. It's about standing when you'd rather run." Grace held onto those words like a lifeline, her heart softening for the first time in months. In that church buried under snow, surrounded by silence and firelight, she finally began to believe again. By morning, the storm had quieted to a bitter wind whispering through the trees. The air inside the church was cold again, the fire little more than glowing coals. Jack sat alone at the front pew, his elbows resting on his knees, deep in thought. Grace slept near the altar, her face calm at last. Ayla woke slowly, stretching before noticing his father's distant stare. He walked over, rubbing his hands for warmth. "You okay, Dad?" Jack didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the wooden cross ahead. "She's got guts," he said finally. "I'll give her that." Eli tilted his head. "You don't believe her story?" Jack exhaled through his nose, weary. "I've seen enough people use stories to get what they want. Some truth mixed with lies. That's how the world works now." Eli frowned. "She doesn't seem like that kind of person." Jack looked at him, his expression hard. "You think I didn't see people like her overseas? Folks with tears in their eyes one minute, betrayal in their hands the next." The boy's shoulders tensed. "This isn't a war, Dad." Jack's tone sharpened. "It's always a war, son. The battlefield just changes." His words cut through the quiet like a blade, the bitterness behind them startling even himself. Eli didn't back down. "She told us the truth," he said. "And even if she didn't, she's scared. You think Mom would have sent her out into that storm?" The mention of his wife's name hit Jack like a blow. He turned his gaze away, jaw clenched. "Don't bring your mother into this." Eli's voice rose, full of the conviction only youth can carry. "Why not? She believed in people. She believed in mercy." His tone softened. "She believed in you." Jack stood abruptly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "And look where that belief got her," he said, his voice trembling with anger and grief. "Faith doesn't stop pain, Eli. It just makes it hurt longer." For a moment, the church felt smaller, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken years. Ayla stared at his father, eyes shining. "You don't mean that." Jack turned, his face shadowed. "Maybe I do." Silence followed, thick and raw. Grace stirred from her sleep, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" she asked softly. Eli glanced at her, then back at his father. "Tell her, Dad," he said bitterly. "Tell her why you stopped believing in anything." Jack's voice was low, controlled. "That's enough." But Eli pressed on. "You're scared to care about anyone again. That's what this is. You don't want to get hurt." Jack's hands slammed against the pew, startling them both. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everything," he said, his voice cracking under the strain. "To hold someone's hand while the light goes out of their eyes and realize prayer doesn't change a damn thing." Grace rose slowly, her eyes soft but firm. "He's not wrong, Jack," she said quietly. "Pain changes you, but it doesn't have to keep you there." Jack looked at her, breathing hard. "You think I can just pray my way out of it?" She met his gaze without flinching. "No, but maybe you can forgive yourself enough to start again." The words hit him deeper than he expected. Jack turned away, his eyes glistening. Eli stepped forward, voice breaking. "Mom used to say, mercy is never wasted. Maybe that's what God's trying to tell us right now." Jack froze, his son's words hanging in the air like a sacred echo. Grace stood beside Eli, her expression calm but resolute. "She was right," she said softly. "Mercy isn't weakness, Jack. It's the strength to let love win one more time." The old soldier's shoulders slumped. The storm outside was gone, but the one inside him was still raging, fierce and relentless. Finally, Jack spoke, his tone barely more than a whisper. "I don't know if I remember how." Grace stepped closer, her hand resting gently on the back of the pew. "You don't have to remember," she said. "You just have to be willing." Jack met her gaze, the anger fading, replaced by something fragile surrender. Eli watched, tears streaming freely now, not from fear, but relief. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was holy. The kind of silence where something broken starts to mend. Outside, the sun broke through the thinning clouds, sending a shaft of golden light through the church window. It landed on the three of them, Father, son, and stranger, bound by grace they hadn't earned, but had been given anyway. For the first time in years, Jack Miller bowed his head, not out of duty, but out of humility. The war inside him was beginning to end. Dawn crept slowly over the frozen plains, brushing the horizon with a faint silver light. The storm had spent itself at last, leaving behind a quiet that felt sacred, the kind of stillness that comes after confession, when the soul has finally spoken everything it needed to say. Inside the small church, the air was cold but calm. The fire had burned low, a soft glow of coals painting the wooden floor in amber. Jack sat alone near the altar, elbows on his knees, head bowed. He wasn't praying at first, not in the way he used to, but somewhere between silence and breath, the old habit found him. His lips moved with no words at all, only the soundless rhythm of a man relearning how to speak to God. Eli stood near the window, peering out at the pale morning light. The world looked new, wrapped in a blanket of snow that glistened like crystal. He turned toward his father, hesitant to break the moment. "It's beautiful out there," he said softly. Jack didn't look up but smiled faintly. It usually is after a fight. Grace, sitting a few pews back, watched them quietly. Her face was tired but peaceful, her hands folded in her lap. The storm inside her had calmed too. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from anything. She was just there, alive, warm, seen. The kind of peace that felt fragile but real. Jack lifted his head, exhaling deeply. "You know," he said, his voice rough, "I used to come to places like this when I was deployed. Not to pray, just to sit. Didn't matter if it was a church, a field, or the back of a Humvee. Sometimes you just need somewhere quiet enough to hear your own thoughts." Grace smiled faintly. "Did you ever get answers?" Jack's eyes softened. "Not then. But I think I'm getting one now." He turned his gaze toward her. "You being here, this storm, this night, maybe it was all a way of reminding me that faith doesn't die. It just waits." The church was filled with the warmth of stillness, a kind of unspoken gratitude that didn't need words. Grace looked toward the altar, her voice gentle. "I used to think God stopped listening to me. But maybe I was the one who stopped talking," Jack nodded. "I did too." The two sat in silence, their shared admission more powerful than any sermon. Eli walked up between them, glancing from one to the other. "So what happens now?" he asked. Jack chuckled quietly. "Now we start moving forward." Grace looked at the snow outside, sunlight beginning to break through the clouds. "The storm's over," she said. "We can make it to town soon." Jack nodded. "We'll drive you." They began packing what little they had, folding blankets and gathering the remaining supplies. Jack checked his old rifle one last time, not out of fear, but habit, then leaned it gently against the pew. As he turned, his eyes landed on the cross above the altar. The light from the rising sun touched it just right, making it glow with a golden shimmer. He felt something shift deep within him, a peace he hadn't felt since before the war. Without thinking, he walked forward, knelt, and bowed his head. Grace froze, watching, her breath catching in her throat. For a long time he said nothing, only knelt there, shoulders trembling slightly, as though laying down a burden too heavy to carry any longer. Eli watched in silence, his eyes wide. He had never seen his father pray, not once since his mother's funeral. Grace stood slowly, her hand covering her heart. The church was silent except for the faint hum of the wind easing through the cracks. Jack whispered something no one else could hear, then raised his head, eyes glistening. When he turned, there was no shame, no bitterness, only calm. He stood slowly and looked at Grace. "Thank you," he said simply. She shook her head, tears forming. "For what?" He smiled faintly. "For reminding me what mercy looks like." Outside, the last flakes of snow drifted lazily through the air, the sky brightening with the promise of a new day. Jack stepped to the door and opened it. The cold air rushed in, sharp but clean, carrying the smell of pine and frost. For the first time, it didn't feel harsh. It felt like freedom. "Let's get you home," he said, Glancing back at Grace and Ela, the boy grinned. Home sounds good. Grace smiled, a quiet peace glowing in her eyes. As they stepped outside, the sunlight broke fully through the clouds, lighting the church cross behind them. It gleamed like a promise, unspoken but eternal. The storm had finally broken, and in its silence, faith had been reborn. The drive into town was slow but calm. The roads were still slick with ice, the world around them wrapped in blinding white. Jack kept both hands on the wheel, the truck's engine humming steadily beneath the quiet. Eli sat beside him, boots tapping lightly on the floorboard, while Grace stared out the window in silence. The snow-covered fields stretched endlessly on either side, fences buried, barns glistening like silver in the early light. After the chaos of the storm, the stillness felt unreal, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath and decided to start over. Grace broke the silence first. "I can't thank you enough," she said softly. "You saved my life." Jack's eyes stayed on the road. "Maybe we just met halfway," he replied. "You needed saving, and I needed reminding." Grace looked at him, confused. "Reminding of what?" Jack smiled faintly. "That doing right still matters, even when it costs you." She nodded slowly, her gaze turning back to the passing landscape. "I almost forgot that myself." The truck rattled over a patch of frozen gravel, and Eli looked up at her. "You didn't forget," he said. "You just needed a place to remember." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the truck filling the spaces where words used to be. Grace finally spoke again, her voice quieter now. "I don't know where I'll go next," she admitted. "I don't have family anymore." "Not really." Jack's eyes softened. "Sometimes family ain't about blood," he said. "It's about who shows up when the storm hits." She smiled at that, a small, genuine smile that carried both sorrow and hope. "Then I guess I found some family for a night," she said. Eli grinned. "For more than a night, I think." As the town came into view, small houses half buried under snow, a few smoke trails rising from chimneys, Grace's expression grew distant again. "I should probably find somewhere to stay," she said. Jack nodded. "We'll take you to Pastor Harlan's place. He's got a guest room for folks who need a fresh start." Grace looked at him, surprised. "You sure?" "I'm sure," he said simply. "He helped me once. Guess it's time I return the favor." The truck turned down a narrow road leading toward the little white house beside the church. The same church, Jack realized, where he and Eli had stopped for Christmas service years ago, before everything changed. When they pulled up, Jack turned off the engine and looked at Grace. "You'll be all right," he said. "You've got something most people spend a lifetime chasing, a clean conscience." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "And what about you?" Jack looked out toward the horizon. "I've got something I thought I lost." "What's that?" she asked softly. "Peace," he said. She reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You helped me find mine, too." He nodded, too moved to speak. Grace gathered her coat and opened the door. The cold air rushed in, swirling snow at her feet. She stepped out, turning back one last time. "Thank you," she said. "For everything," Jack nodded once. "Take care, Grace." She walked up the path toward the house, her figure small against the bright morning light. Eli watched her go, then turned to his father. "You think we'll see her again?" Jack smiled, eyes still on the church steeple in the distance. "If the good Lord wants us to, we will." They sat in silence for a moment before Jack started the truck again. The road ahead was clear now, sunlight glinting off the ice like diamonds. As they drove away, the camera of memory lingered on the small church behind them, its doors still open, candles still flickering inside, waiting for the next weary traveler to find shelter. The storm had passed, but the message remained. Faith, when shared, multiplies. And somewhere inside that quiet town, 3 hearts that had once been lost were now in their own ways found again. The week that followed moved slow, the way time does after something sacred happens. The snow melted in sheets off barn roofs. The town roads cleared, and life resumed its quiet rhythm. Jack and Eli returned to their daily chores, feeding the livestock, repairing fences, mending what the storm had broken. But the silence that filled their small home wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Something invisible had shifted inside those walls, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself but settles deep, like roots under thawing ground. Jack spoke more softly these days, smiled a little easier, and even whistled once while fixing the truck. Eli noticed it right away. On Sunday, as sunlight poured through the window, Eli said, "Dad, we should go back to the church." Jack looked up from his coffee. "For service?" The boy nodded. "Yeah, it feels right." Jack hesitated, fingers tapping against his mug. He hadn't been back there since the night of the storm. Not since the moment he'd knelt and found peace waiting for him. Part of him feared going back might break the spell, that the calm he'd found would vanish once he faced it in daylight. But looking at his son's hopeful eyes, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The drive was quiet, the air crisp with early spring. When they reached the small church on the hill, the morning sun caught the steeple cross, making it shine like polished silver. Jack parked the truck and shut off the engine. They walked up the snowy steps together, boots crunching softly. Inside, it looked almost the same wooden pews, the same old hymn books scattered along the seats. But something felt different. It felt alive. The candles had burned down to stubs, but their faint scent of wax and smoke lingered. And there, on the front pew where Grace had sat, a folded piece of paper rested neatly under a candle holder. Eli noticed it first. "Dad, look." He picked it up carefully, the paper slightly wrinkled but dry. Jack frowned, taking it in his hands. The handwriting was neat, written with care, graceful loops and steady strokes. He unfolded it, reading silently as the morning light spread across the page. "You reminded me that good men still exist. Thank you for being the answer to a prayer I'd stopped saying. The storm that brought me here saved more than my life. It saved my faith. Grace." Jack stood there a long while, eyes locked on the words. The church was silent except for the faint creak of wood settling in the cold. Eli stepped closer. "She came back," he whispered. Jack nodded, his throat tight. "She did." His fingers brushed over the ink like it was something holy. The words didn't just belong to Grace. They belonged to all of them. Each sentence carried the weight of what had happened, what had healed. Eli looked up at his father, his voice soft. "Can we keep it?" Jack smiled faintly, folding the note with care. "No," he said quietly. "It belongs here. Some words are meant to stay where they were written." He placed the note back on the pew, smoothing it gently. For a long moment, they both just stood there, father and son, the sunlight washing over them through stained glass. Jack felt something rise in his chest, a peace deeper than any sermon could offer. Grace's words had reminded him that mercy wasn't a moment, it was a way of living. As he turned toward his son, he saw the reflection of that truth in Eli's young eyes, the same compassion that had softened his heart during the storm. Without realizing it, Jack smiled fully for the first time in years. "Let's sit a while," he said. "Feels right." They sat in the same pew where Grace had once prayed, and for a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of gratitude, of something divine that lingered quietly in the air. The wind outside brushed softly against the church walls, as though whispering thank you. And when they finally stood to leave, Jack didn't look back at the note. He didn't need to. He knew the words by heart. Weeks passed, and spring began to thaw the last traces of winter. The fields turned soft underfoot, and the sky stretched wide and blue again. Life on the ranch fell into rhythm, feed runs, early mornings, quiet suppers. Yet under that rhythm was something new, peace. Jack still carried the same scars, but they no longer defined him. His prayers, once silenced by grief, had returned in small ways, sometimes whispered at dawn, sometimes spoken aloud when Eli couldn't hear. He didn't force them, he just let them come. Faith, he'd learned, didn't arrive in a rush. It grew slowly, like sunlight creeping across a frostbitten field. One Sunday morning, Jack and Eli pulled up once more to the little white church. Bells rang softly across the valley, calling the townsfolk to gather. The doors were open, warm light spilling onto the steps. Inside, familiar faces smiled and nodded, people who had heard whispers of what happened that night. That Miller boy and his daddy saved a woman during the storm, someone had said. She left a note that changed him. Jack didn't correct them. The truth was simpler. It wasn't the note that changed him, it was grace itself. They took their seats in the same pew, sunlight glinting off the wooden cross. The pastor, an old friend from Jack's younger days, began the service with a verse that made his heart still. "Blessed are the merciful," he read, "for they shall obtain mercy." Jack looked down, a quiet smile forming. Eli leaned close and whispered, "That sounds like something Mom would have said." Jack nodded. "Maybe it's something she did say. Just took me a while to hear it." They both smiled then, the kind of smile born not from happiness alone, but from healing. When the service ended, the congregation lingered, shaking hands and sharing stories. Pastor Harlan approached Jack, his eyes kind. "Haven't seen you here in a long while," he said. Jack chuckled softly. "Guess I was waiting for the right storm." The pastor smiled knowingly. "Funny thing about storms," he said. "They don't just wash things away. Sometimes they bring what was lost back to shore." Jack nodded, glancing toward the window. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and new grass, life beginning again. Later, as they stepped outside into the bright morning, Jack paused at the top of the steps. He looked at Eli, then at the horizon where sunlight danced over the fields. "Next storm," he said quietly, "we'll be ready to open the doors again." Eli grinned, his eyes shining. "Think there'll be another?" Jack placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "There's always another, but now we know what to do when it comes." They stood there together, the church behind them, the wide world ahead, a father and son no longer haunted by loss, but guided by purpose. As they walked toward the truck, the church bell rang once more, a sound that echoed through the hills, clear and strong. It wasn't a call for help this time. It was a call of gratitude. Somewhere in town, Grace Turner might have heard it too, and smiled, knowing the storm that nearly broke her had, in truth, delivered 3 hearts back to faith. Jack opened the truck door, pausing for a final look at the cross gleaming in the sun. "Come on, son," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Let's get home." And as the truck rolled down the country road, the snowmelt glittered like silver streams beside them, the last reminder of the storm that had changed everything. Because sometimes the miracle isn't surviving the storm, it's finding grace within it.